everyone. Welcome to this BAKERview seminar all on flatbreads and pizza. I'm Dr. Lynn Carson, your host for today. This seminar is brought to you by two fabulous sponsors, Vantage Food and Anton Par. Vantage Food is a market leader offering customized solutions, in-house research and development, and an extensive portfolio of food processing ingredients. Their offerings include release agents, emulsifiers, stabilizers, processing aids, shortenings, esters, polysorbates, antifoams, specialty ingredients, spraying equipment, and much, much more. They also offer a full line of clean label solutions, including allergen-free, non-GMO, organic, kosher, and halal. Now, Anton Par USA is dedicated to delivering premium instruments and first-class customer service in the US. They fuse Bray Bender's expertise as a supplier of measuring and process technology for food and feed, plastics, rubber, and other areas with Anton Par's unrivaled reputation as a leading producer and global distributor of high accurate laboratory instruments and processing measuring systems. So now I'm going to share my presentation on pizza and flatbreads. That's what we're here today for. And after my presentation, we will have a Q&A where it's going to be a nice interaction between the guests here, yourself and I. And yeah, so hold your questions until then. And here is my presentation. All right, pizza and flatbread. This presentation is actually targeted to its high output pizza production plants and flatbread bakeries. The technologies, however, here can be transferred to smaller retail establishments on a case-to-case scenario. But the majority of what is discussed here is mostly for high output operations. The current pizza market is valued at it's $148.6 billion in 2023, and it's expected to reach $222.5 billion by 2032, with a compound annual growth rate of 4.45 during the 2024 to 2032 period. The flatbread market is actually valued at $43.7 billion in 2022, and it's expected to grow up to $70.7 billion by 2030, with a CAGR of 6.2 during the 2023 to the 2030 period. So as you can see, these two are experiencing one of the largest growth in the bakery sector. Pizza is one of the most popular baked products consumed worldwide. It's an oven-baked flatbread commonly covered with tomato sauce and mozzarella cheese with a few more toppings on top, depends on where you are in the world. In the US, pizza is everywhere, right? Like in a small town, we probably have about 4 or 5 pizza shops. So modern day pizza is considered to have been developed in 1889 when Queen Margherita requested a pizza made with the colors of the Italian flag, and thus the Margherita pizza was born. All right, so in the US, we have these different types of pizza. And of course, when you go to Chicago, you have the deep dish pizza. You go to Detroit, you have, a flatter pizza. You go to New York, it's this long, big, arc-shaped, sloppy thing that you cannot hold with one hand, right? It just flops over. That's how I feel like New York pizza is. Neapolitan pizza, it's a little more crust, a little more crisp to it. And then, of course, you have the gluten-free pizza, which is To me, it's not the ultimate, but it is what gluten-free lovers can have. You have the cauliflower crust, or you have a keto crust that's made with like almond flour. I've seen tons of different gluten-free options out there. And then we have the St. Louis pizza, which is a big, like actually a really big pie, right? It's a little, I think the main difference between St. Louis and New York, which is a little bit different, is the St. Louis actually has a crispier crust and it's a bigger pie. So if anybody has any kind of thoughts or comments on the different kinds of pizza in the market today, please type it in. I would love to see what you feel about this topic. Okay, so flatbreads are actually, if you think about it, the base of pizza crust. This is why we bunch them together. Flatbreads are flat sheets of dough, usually placed on a hot griddle or baking stone so that the dough can be cooked. A wide variety of products considered flatbread are actually available worldwide. I recently helped a lavash baker scale up using a mix of hydration and reducing agents. The formula for flatbreads are drastically different when you scale up from handmade bread. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so for flatbreads, we have pita, we have chapati, naan, and also focaccia bread. Those are like the high volume breads being made and sold in the US right now. Okay, let's talk about ingredients. So flour, especially because flour is more than 50-60% of the final dough formulation. Okay, flour is the essential baking block in the creation of pizza and flatbreads, playing a very important role in shaping their texture, flavor, and structural integrity. In pizza, flour serves as the primary ingredient, providing the foundation for the dough's elasticity and chewiness. In flatbread, it provides the foundation for the dough's structure, allowing it to be rolled out into thin, flat shapes before being baked or cooked on a hot surface. Therefore, the flour used needs to provide a relaxed and flowable dough that is actually resilient as well. Sometimes, pockets can be created within the flatbread, and that could be considered desirable or not desirable. Depends on what product you are trying to get to. So water is the number one binding agent in the formula. It is elemental in the formulation of pizza and flatbreads, contributing to the hydration and elasticity of the dough, as well as playing a crucial role in the cooking process. In pizza, water acts as a binding ingredient for the flour, facilitating the formation of gluten. In flatbread, water serves as a binding agent and helping bring other ingredients together in the flour and other ingredients into a cohesive, resilient dough. The hydration level of the dough influences its consistency and ease of handling, as well as the final texture of the baked flatbread. So don't forget, because water is the number two ingredient in these formulation. It's important that you optimize the amount of water in the dough. And to really understand and optimize the water of the dough, you need to use some analytical instrumentation like the farinograph to really understand how much water I could put into the dough. Okay, you don't want to put less water because you're talking about doughs that are going to be sheeted, right? So you need to put as much water as possible, air on the high side, so that it sheets better, right? But not as sticky that it sticks to the roll. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the lecture. Okay. Now, how is fat important in pizza and dough formulation? Whether in the form of oil, butter, or lard, it actually serves multiple important roles in the preparation of pizza and flatbreads, contributing to texture, flavor, and overall quality. In pizza, fat is often added in the form of olive oil or another kind of vegetable oil. The fat helps to tenderize the dough, resulting in a softer and more delicate crust, actually. In flatbread, it adds moisture and richness to the dough. Whether it's olive oil, butter, or another type of fat, the addition helps make the dough flexible and it improves the texture and flavor of the flatbread, resulting in a softer and more tender crumb. Well, let's talk about sugar. Some people add sugar in there for the flavor and the browning because not some flatbreads just don't get enough fermentation. Okay, sugar is used in smaller quantities compared to flour, water, and fat. Actually, it plays a significant role in the preparation of pizza and flatbreads, contributing to flavor, texture, and browning. In pizza, sugar is often added to provide food for the yeast during fermentation, and it gives the dough a really good aroma and contributing to browning as well. In flatbread, sugar is often added to the dough to balance the flavors and promote browning during baking. Now let's talk about yeast. Yeast is a fundamental ingredient in pizza, focaccia, and flatbreads, serving as the main leavening agent responsible for their characteristic rise and airy texture. In pizza, yeast plays a crucial role in fermentation, converting sugars in the dough into carbon dioxide and alcohol. And this is the reason why some pizzas have large air pockets, which is really desirable in places like the Detroit or the St. Louis kind of pizza. Okay. In flatbreads, yeast is the primary leavening agent. Sometimes people use chemical leavening as well, but yeast is actually preferred because of the taste and aroma of fermentation. It helps give dough its rise and to help develop a light and airy crumb. Okay, eggs. So, do we use eggs in these systems for pizza? Well, I have seen um, eggs being used in the gluten-free crusts. Okay, such instances, it enhances the texture, gives a little bit more crust to it. Of course, the egg yolks provide the Maillard browning, so it gives flavor of eggy, custardy kind of a crust. It also helps brown the crust properly. And of course, egg yolks are made up of fats and emulsifiers, so it provides that softening effect on the gluten-free crusts. All right, let's talk about pizza processing. How fun! Actually, the reason why I say it's fun is because it's really straightforward. I mean, there's no long fermentation, there's no long sponges to deal with. It's basically kneading and mixing it till, optimal, the perfect dough window test. Okay. After mixing and kneading, you go into bulk fermentation, which is usually anywhere between 40 to an hour, 40 to 60 minutes. So during that bulk fermentation, what happens is, the yeast ferments, it consumes all the carbs, and it ferments it into acid and aroma and just a beautiful taste for the pizza. So fermentation is really important because the longer fermentation you give it, the better pull, the better aroma comes out of it because of the acids. And when you produce that much acids during fermentation, it really softens the proteins to give it a more flowable kind of characteristic. Okay. So after bulk fermentation, on most lines, you go through some kind of a lamination process. And when we say lamination, we're talking about putting these through reducing rollers. So most of the time, it's like 3 rollers, from a thick dough right down to a skinny dough. And then you use a cutter to cut it. Some of the dough goes back into rework, while most of the doughs either like par baked and packed, frozen par baked, or they are topped and with tomato sauce, mozzarella cheese and pepperoni, right? So that's usually if you see high output pizza bakeries, they're like usually one pizza every minute, right? Sorry, one pizza every second. So that whole process itself is actually mesmerizing. You can actually stand there and look at machines top pizza for for a long time. So after topping, that's also a process where it goes into IQF or individually quick frozen pizzas, or they can be baked and then packed. Okay, so that's what I love about pizza processing. It's straightforward, it's fast from beginning to end. It takes less than 90 minutes sometimes. But yeah, it's a very simple and easy process. Now, flatbreads may sound like a simple and easy process, but actually it's a little more tricky because you're not topping it and you're not covering up its flaws. So if you make any kind of mistakes in the mixing and the fermentation process, you can really see it in the final product. So again, it starts with dough mixing. Most of the time, it's a straight dough process, and because its sheeting property is very important, you really need to give it some kind of a rest from the mixing process to the sheeting process, right? So sometimes bakers put a fermentation step in there from anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes. Sometimes bakers put the fermentation process before the final dough mixing. Okay, so there are very different methods of doing this. It depends on what you want in the final product quality would determine whether you put the fermentation step before or after the mixing step. Okay, so after fermentation or resting, we go into sheeting. So sheeting is a little different in flatbreads because you're trying to get the dough as thin as possible. And there's also other methods of doing this. There's also the dough press, where you weigh out the 1 to 2 ounce dough and you just hot press it or cold press it, and then it goes into the oven to bake, right? So there are many ways of doing this. There's not like the real difference is really the output rate. Sheeting has a higher output rate than dough press, right? Actually double the output. So that this is why some bakers like to just stick with sheeting. The baking is usually on a hot stone or a conveyor belt, and that's usually less than 2 to 3 minutes. So you can see like a flatbread oven is like this, like much shorter than the pizza oven, and it's really a high intense heat for a very short amount of time. Okay. And the cooling part of flatbreads is also really, really fast. Packaging after cooling is important because you don't want the flatbread to cool for too long, or else it will dry out and it will crack, when it's being used. Okay, so we are talking about the conditions of flatbread and what's the difference. Over here, we're looking at 3 different kinds of flatbread. We're talking about pita bread, the chapati, which is Indian bread, which is the same as naan as well. Both are Indian breads. So the pita bread and naan uses yeast, and that's why they have such large pockets, right? The dynamic systems. Chapati is very much like tortilla, and sometimes, chapati uses baking powder for the leavening agent. We can go through all these different things, but it's all in the pocket guide, and I urge you guys to, go look at the different properties of these different flatbreads if you're further interested in these things. Okay. All right, focaccia. So focaccia is interesting because the hydration of focaccia is very different from all the other flatbreads. It's a very high hydrated dough, and because of that, there's dilution of the protein network, and that's how you get the large, big holes in there, right? Okay, so focaccia mostly come from a sponge and dough process. It's it could be a Polish, it could be a biga, it could, be fermented prior to the final dough mixing process, 4 to 5 hours. It has a lot of variations. And of course, the more water you put in the system, the longer the fermentation, and the longer the fermentation, the better the aroma. So it's just, there's no right or wrong way of doing focaccia. It's just the more fermentation you give it, the better it tastes. And with focaccia too, the better proteins that you use, like if you use a bread flour versus an all-purpose flour, you get actually a better crisp to it. So again, many different ways of making focaccia, but basically it goes through the sponge, the makeup, the mixing, and then the final proofing. And then it gets sheeted out into baking sheets, large baking sheets, and pretty much baked. A little longer baking time because of higher hydration, but actually the cooking is actually driving out the water during the process. So most focaccia bread are sliced and packaged before they are sold. Okay. So one thing I would like to point out for Brave Bender is their 3-phase system. It's important to understand and analyze your flour because that's the only way you would know if you've put in enough water. Too much water is going to cause the system to stick to the rollers, and sheeting becomes really, really difficult. Okay. And also after baking, packaging, that dough after packaging doesn't when it's rolled up. All these go back to the stability of the dough, and that could be analyzed using the extensor graph. Extensor graph determines the elasticity of dough to predict its baking properties, and this is especially important for pizza and flatbread. Okay. Last but not least, we're talking about the predicting bread quality. And Brave Bender has a system called a mylograph, which evaluates the gelatinization properties of starch as well as the enzymatic activity in the flour. And this is important because not every flour batch that comes into the production plant is the same, right? Some might have higher enzymatic activity, and that will indicate some kind of sprout damage during harvesting, and that would give you a very different dough. It's almost like sticky to the point of, you're going to scratch your head like, did I put in too much water in this formula? So amylograph analysis is so important in terms of implementing it into your quality receiving system, because you just want to evaluate out the sprout damage, right? So certain regions and certain plants, when you're processing dough in such huge volumes, just a little bit of sprout damage will cause your line to shut down. So you want to prevent that from happening. To learn more about unparalleled, that's the QR code right there. Just scan it and learn what other equipments they have and how they can help you in implementing your quality programs. Right. So now we are going to go into the Q&A session. But before we do that, I would like to thank our sponsors for allowing us to have the seminar and give the Pocket Guide for free. And to download the Pocket Guide, just go ahead and scan that code there. And you get free access to everything about pizza and flatbreads. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. We would like to see if there are any questions out there. I've seen lower quality, protein quality flour being used in flatbreads because of the extensibility factor, which is more important than the elasticity factor in flatbreads. So you can find that in all-purpose flour. And I would specifically ask your supplier for pizza flour. It's very, very close to all-purpose flour in most regions of the world. So I wouldn't go for black bread flour because it's too high in protein. I would go more towards OO type flour, and actually in the US we call that all-purpose flour. So in high output places, they are, mechanically dispensed on top of the dough. You don't usually put them as inclusions because it's going to affect the volume of the dough. So I wouldn't add anything other than small little dried spices in there. Because even garlic, if you add it in there, it's going to impact the dough quality significantly, and you're going to have shredded dough as you go through the sheeting process. So I would add as little as possible during the mixing process, and basically top the focaccia dough just before you bake it. Okay, hope that helps. It depends on what you're looking for in the final product, because yeast is important for larger holes, and if that's not important in your final product as a frozen dough, don't use yeast. Just go straight to chemical leavening. I would go into encapsulated chemical leavening because that's really going to help give the dough a lift after it's thawed and then it's baked, right? So definitely go straight into the chemical leavening encapsulates when you're going to go do that. So definitely depends on your final product, but if it's for C-stores, I would completely skip the yeast and just go straight to chemical leavening. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that, if you could? Because that is a giant question. I see a lot of gluten-free pizza out there with different properties. Like cauliflower is one of the biggest categories here in the US for gluten-free. But it's a vegetable, right? Like it's a vegetable flour. So you have to add a lot of other things into the formula. Um, Other formulas include like different ancient grains, or even nut flours. So you're talking about a whole different range of flours altogether. Protein quality and quantity is very different in terms of measurement of gluten-free. But I believe Anton Parr would have the services to help you analyze that in your gluten-free dough. But understand that when you replace gluten in a system like that, it's also getting reinforcements from modified starches, um, hydrocolloids, and also fibers. Okay. So the flour for gluten-free is not measured against the protein, but measured as a whole building block altogether. So it's a little different when it comes to setting specs for gluten-free pizza. It's just different. I hope that helps. Okay, so blisters can be caused by a few things, and blisters are an indication of well, in most breads is an indication of higher hydration dose, but it's also when air pockets come together, they are they're indicating an unstable system. Okay, so anytime you get bigger, larger bubbles on flatbread, it means that your system is unstable. Okay, so the number one thing that you can use is to use emulsifiers to stabilize the system. Right, so once you use emulsifiers, those little small air bubbles remain little air bubbles during the sheeting and the fermentation process. So emulsifiers in clean label systems would include enzymes, would include lecithin, would include egg yolks, right? And other systems, we have the beautiful mono and diglycerides, the datums, the SSLs. Those are excellent, excellent emulsifiers, and those are going to help you prevent blisters on your flatbread. And also you have to understand your system. If you give it a lot of fermentation, you're going to put in a lot of acids in the flatbread. And with that, you destabilize the system when you ferment your flatbread for a long time. You're going to get more blisters when you give it a longer fermentation. So there are very different ways of looking at this, but basically when blisters happen, it's because your dough system is unstable. So look into stabilizing your dough system. I would say it's a high hydration dough that requires a longer fermentation process. So don't skim on the fermentation process, because if you do, then you're probably not going to get enough rest and hydration for the proteins to flow. Okay, hydrate and flow, that's important. So that's one key parameter is fermentation. The next one would be well, the first one would be hydration, second one would be fermentation, and basically get it to a point where you can sheet it. And at that point, it depends on the speed of your process. If it's a hand laminated dough, then it's going to go slower than the high speed lamination process. And I've seen both done. It's possible. Unfortunately, with the high speed lamination process, you're going to have to go with a lower hydration dough because it does stick to the reducing rolls. With handmade product, you can go higher in hydration, but it affects the output. Okay, so that's the difference in that. So sheeting, the sheeting process for focaccia dough is really the limiting factor to how much focaccia you can actually produce within the hour. So I think without knowing too much of what you do, I can't really comment on the really important part of, the control parameters for the production of your kind of focaccia. I hope that helps. Let's say if you cannot retard your dough overnight before shaping for pizza, um, most pizza doughs are not retarded, not put in the refrigerator. So let's talk about flatbreads, because I've heard some flatbreads are fermented overnight. And the reason is because it just gives the proteins a lot of time for hydration, a lot of time for relaxation, and it sheets much, much better. And if you don't have that amount of time, then you might look into reducing agents. So in the baker's toolbox, we have L-cysteine. L-cysteine is created from proteins. It's a fermentation process. So it basically relaxes the dough like immediately. Okay. If you don't like to use L-cysteine, then there is reducing yeast, which is inactivated yeast. And that is that looks nicer in the formula. It actually gives the formula a better aroma, but that can be used as well. Just know that the difference between L-cysteine and inactivated yeast is that the dynamics of the chemical reaction that's going on there. You can almost control the L-cysteine in terms of how it cuts the mixing time and make it more flowable. It's a little more difficult to control inactivated yeast. Okay, so that's the major difference between these two ingredients. But the main purpose is to relax the dough, cut the mixing time, and make it more sheetable or easier to hot press or cold press. Okay, so that's the option if you don't have availability to ferment the dough overnight. Sourdough pizza is it's increasing, but I've not heard of any large scale production using the um, traditional or artisanal way of sourdough, if that makes sense. But I've seen high output places put in, sourdough powder, right? So if you're talking about scaling up an artisanal process, that's going to be very interesting. Mainly because with sourdough, you really need to control your time and temperature throughout the entire process. It's extra, extra delicate, right? With traditional pizza doughs, you're talking about a very fast incoming, fast outgoing process, right? In, out, that's it. Short time doughs. With sourdough, the process of fermentation and fermenting something for 24 to 36 hours prior to mixing, that is going to really affect the final dough, because how are you going to control the temperature and the time during that 36 hours on a large scale? Like, you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of dough. It's almost, I say, impossible, or rather expensive. No one's going to have that kind of space in their processing plant to keep that much dough. So if you're doing a really small scale sourdough, you can actually do it, right? Because you can each control small batches of sourdough. The only thing about sourdough is really understanding and keeping the consistency with the time and the temperature of the dough. That's how it's going to impact things on your end. Okay, well, it depends on what kind of herbs. Those herbs, they have different kind of chemicals in them. And not only that, if you talk about things like rosemary, right? Like it's rosemary is a natural antimicrobial. And when you add rosemary in there, it's going to just affect the yeast. It's like the yeast hates that, right? Like, I mean, we love the smell of rosemary, but I don't think the yeast loves that. So it does affect fermentation for rosemary, for garlic as well. Um, and other herbs, I don't know, it's not been really studied on things like oregano or thyme or other herbs and their effect on dough. It's not, it's not a big, it's not a huge application in breads and dough, so I don't know. But what I suspect is it does give up some kind of chemical reaction, and it affects the proteins. And it's also, large herbs like rosemary that's cut into the dough matrix. So it does affect how the bubbles come together. So it makes it more unstable. So you're going to get a lower, less airy dough. And also, if you can possibly add the spices after the sheeting or just prior to the sheeting process, that'll be perfect. But to actually mix it in, I think you're going to have a big problem with herbs in the dough on a high output process. I think you need to look into making the system stronger, because anytime you add inclusions like bran or a non-wheat grain, which spelt is, which buckwheat is, it's not a gluten conforming grain, you are just going to dilute the protein networks. And with that, you have to put in more gluten, right? Or you have to put in not just gluten, but wheat protein isolates. Most of the protein, what do you call, gluten companies have wheat protein isolates. And because gluten is made out of gliadin or glutenin, they have this two separated out into this wheat isolates. You just need to focus on getting the gliadin portion, because the glutenin portion is bucky. You don't want that. You want a gliadin portion, which is more flowable. And I would highly use these wheat protein isolates over vital wheat gluten any day when you're working with all these non-gluten flours, okay? Mainly because it's not going to process well if you go above 5%, 10%. Like if you use whole wheat flour, I would just advise, not more than 10%. Spelt flour, 5%. Buckwheat flour, 3%. Like that's as much as I would like recommend you to use if you're going to add a healthy halo to a high speed line. But if you're not a high speed line, then these proportions can double, right? You're going to see a difference in hydration. You're going to see a difference in sheeting because your dough is going to tear more. So those are the things that you have to look for as you go into this healthy halo area. Good luck. Well, at 600, you pretty much burn everything. It, again, depends on the product. If we're talking about pizza, it's a huge difference. Um, I wouldn't bake a pizza at 600. I really wouldn't. Um, it's if you're baking it that high to get the kind of results that you want, then it's not the right kind of oven. Okay. I would go no more than 500. Most of the pizza impingement technology go, the different zones go between 400 and 500. So like enter the zones at 500. It will go down to 450 and then 425 for the longest time, and then go back up to 450, 475. So these zones are usually 4 zones, and they take a step process in cooking the pizza. Okay. That will be the ideal way to cook a pizza. If you're talking about flatbreads are a little different. You have to really implement the heat high up front, and then you bake it for, some people bake it for 30 seconds. Some people bake it for 1 minute. That's why the high temperature can be tolerated. In that aspect, it's important that you start high and then you end low. Okay. Again, I always encourage step processes, as in, don't bake your pizza all in one oven setting. Like, you have to go through the different zones in the oven and to really control the zones to get the most optimal baking. For flatbreads, it's okay to just have one zone, one temperature, but it's always high and intense and short baking time. So that's the biggest difference. Hope that helps. The biggest difference is output. Okay. So I would assume that sheeting is rolling and stretching is dough press. Okay. So I would say the rolling is going to give you higher output than stretching. Okay. But if you have to really work on that, it's because your dough is not well hydrated enough. So the more hydration you give the dough, the more relaxation you give the dough, the easier it is to do both of this. So there is no really right or wrong. It's just what kind of dough you have, and the ability to make more doughs or throw out more doughs, with the rolling process or the stretching process. I assume that stretching could be like throwing it in the air and just keep stretching. Yeah, I was never good at that, but that's kind of like very low output, especially if you make me do it. So I would actually prefer to roll out the dough any day more than stretch dough. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all the questions coming in. I learned something today too. So thank you for joining us for this BAKERview on pizza and flatbreads. Please don't forget to download the Baking Pizza and Flatbread Guide to keep learning. And you have a great day and happy baking.